Thank you so much for joining this session. Welcome to the Sankalp Africa Summit 2021. My name is Ariel Molino with the Sankalp team, and I am exceedingly pleased to be hosting this session at Sankalp today, and really delighted that everyone is coming, joining this session. I would like to start with this session. We'll open with a very short film that was launched at the New Daughters of Africa London launch. This film was made by Nicola Zawadi Cross, who was born in Tanzania and as a true global citizen lives between Trinidad and the UK and my house in Nairobi for quite some time as well. So she's a good friend. Nicola is a good friend of Margaret as well. So just give me a second and I will go ahead and we'll kick this off with the film.
The event was just amazing. Suddenly being aware of a community that had nothing to do with borders or, completely transcending all of that, but being a community was an amazing feeling. And then just realizing that you can be all these different things. You don't have to keep questioning identity. Oh, I must fit into this. Having to decide. I can actually just be all of this.
Yeah, that's exactly what I hope to achieve, and that's really what makes it possible for us all to be in this one book. That there aren't any borders. There aren't. We don't have to deny any part of ourselves in order to fit some shape that somebody else decides we should be.
The thing about the first edition was it was completely and utterly groundbreaking because women and women of colour had never been brought together and recognised.
And also the Pan-African sort of feel of it. So, African was extended to its furthest sort of meaning, not just African specifically from the continent, but you had writers from America, from the Caribbean, etc.
For 7 years, I was living with a man who unfortunately died. I loved my husband. If your brother now wants to take his place in my heart, something that seems impossible to me, let him conquer me.
She's been an anchor, I think, for a lot of Black British writers. Obviously her legacy is Alison and Busby, and then Daughters of Africa, but she's also been a critic and just an activist in terms of lobbying to make publishing more inclusive.
She realized that what she was doing was important not just for her, but for moving people from the margins to the center.
She stood spiritually stark naked at the door of the church. The sun burned her thin exposed skin, but she was no longer afraid of fire.
One of the reasons that I wanted to do Daughters of Africa initially in 1992 was that you would so often come across anthologies of writing from Africa, poetry from Africa, or short stories from the West Indies, or whatever it was, and it wouldn't actually spell out by men, but that was always the default position.
How fortunate to be born in a place named after the most famous person in Zimbabwe's liberation history, a political leader who defied expectations of African women's place by leading an anti-colonial war.
Margaret, to me, is the mother of us all. I think she's a really great model for what we all should be doing with young talent, emerging talent and developing talent, and the talent that is no longer here.
So I sent my manuscript to Margaret, having sent it to many other publishers who just rejected it out of hand. And Margaret, I always remember her because she wrote me this long letter which amounted to, "This is shit, but it's good shit."
I feel guilty because I know it's his voice in my head telling me to make more of an effort. It's hard to describe how heavy my body feels these days. My pen is lighter, so I sit in a cafe and fill paper with haikus. A habit I've always entertained and one my husband used to find endearing. Now he likes to be practical. His words, not mine.
There are so many supremely talented women of African descent who don't get much attention they need to. I mean, if you looked at the mainstream media, you'd think there were just 2 or 3 or 4 or half a dozen. Well, I wanted to say, in the first one, it was 200 plus. In this literature, I want to say, look at all these. This is just touching the surface of it. There's so many. Everybody has to be the first at something, but I don't want to be the only anything.
Great, Marina, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I say good morning. I should say good day because it's 6 o'clock in Trinidad. I don't know what time it is in Kenya or South Africa or perhaps even London, but I'm so happy to be here with you. And thanks, I want to say thanks very much to Ariel and to Sankalp for including this event in this year's program. It's literary. It's not exactly what Sankalp does, but you know, everything is entrepreneurial, everything is business, everything is moving us ahead. The film we just saw actually set the tone for the conversation today between me and lucky me and 4 extraordinary women, all of them writers, all of them from Africa, all of them change agents, and all of them contributors to the remarkable publication that you saw in that film, New Daughters of Africa, an anthology of writing of over 200 women connected to Africa, in Africa and in the diaspora. Everyone listening here is also a change maker, not just the people on the panel. And over the next 90 minutes, we'll be considering the theme of women as change agents and end with revving you up, all up to be the change that you desire and the change that you want to see. And we'll be doing that through 2 ways. We want you to actually think about your power. We want you to actually listen to what people are saying, think about where your power is, to try to identify it and then write it down. And then we want you to post it. There is something called a mural, and there will be a link to it, and you can post your murals on that canvas, and Ariel will share the link and then let you people in, and then everybody will be in. And then through the course of the next hours and a half, we will be taking some of those comments, some of those questions. And in the end, what we hope is that you go back to them and take that away from how you too can maximize the change that you can be. I'm Marina Solanti Brown, and I am the director of the Bocas Lit Fest, which is a literary festival in the Caribbean. In Trinidad and Tobago is a twin island state in the Southern Caribbean. You may not know about it. You may think it's in Jamaica. It's not. It's a separate island, or set of islands. And we started the literary festival. This will be the 11th year. And what we really wanted to do was we wanted to develop and promote a new generation of writers. I actually saw what Margaret and other African people had done in England, where I'd been living for a long time, where they established a prize for African literature. And African literature had sort of fallen off the agenda, really. And when the Kane Prize started, I saw what it did to African writing. So when I got back to Trinidad, I decided I needed to do something similar because Caribbean writing had also fallen off the agenda. I'm in Trinidad. I was born in Trinidad and Tobago, but my mother was actually born in Nigeria nearly 100 years ago this year. And I say to her, and actually as I wrote in New Daughters of Africa, she's actually, I think, the oldest Nigerian or possible African born person in the entire Americas, certainly in Trinidad, maybe in the region. Margaret, of course, this is her brainchild, the New Daughters of Africa. And we're going to start the event with Margaret, but I would first like all 4 people who are here, all you wonderful singular women, to do me the honor of just introducing yourselves. Let's start in Kenya, where this is the host of this event. We have Wanjiku wa Ngugi. Wanjiku.
Hi. Can you guys hear me? You can hear me, yeah? So I'm actually in Atlanta right now, so it's 5 a.m. but it's fine. It's okay. It's fine. I hope I'm wide awake for this event. But well, my name is Wajikwa Agoge. I'm a writer. It's always so difficult to introduce oneself. But however, I teach creative writing at Georgia State. Also finishing up a PhD, and I'm very excited to be here and looking forward to this wonderful discussion that we're gonna have.
I might add that Wanjiku is also part of a Kenyan literary dynasty. She's also a political analyst. She's a founder and former director of the Helsinki African Film Festival, and her short stories and essays have been widely published, and her debut, The Fall of Saints, appeared in 2014. She's also a member of the editorial board of Matatu, which is a journal of African literature and culture and society. Now let's go to South Africa. Panashe Chegumatsi, say hello.
Hi, Marina. Well, actually, I'm Panashe Chigmadze, and I'm actually in the US right now. So it's also 5 a.m. for me. So I happen to be here where I'm studying. I'm doing my PhD in history. So which is really fitting because this is Women's History Month, and what I'm going to be reading is a work of history or historical memoir. My second book was These Bones Will Rise Again, which really was a look or historical memoir thinking through personal and national history through the story of my great-grandmother, or rather my grandmother, who passed on around the time of the coup, not a coup, in Zimbabwe. So that was a way to think through this grand national history through a very personal narrative for me. And so I was born in Zimbabwe, grew up in South Africa, happen to be in the States right now, and I write written a novel before, and I write essays, and contributed to a number of different platforms, but really the word is my trade and my vocation.
And of course, what you did do as well is you started Vanguard famously, which is a platform for young women in South Apartheid, South Africa. Now, Edwidge, are you actually in Cote d'Ivoire? Or are you also in the Americas? Edwidge Renee, where are you?
Indeed, where am I? I'm in Abidjan, so I'm in Cote d'Ivoire. I am Edwidge Renedro. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm a writer. I'm a literary translator also. And last March, I set up 1949, and 1949, which is a library of women's writings from Africa and the Black world. And the mission of the library actually is to unearth and amplify the contributions of African and Black women in order to inspire present and future generations. So it is a bit of a mouthful, but, and the piece that I'm going to be reading actually today touches a bit on, those women that are forgotten, but shouldn't be forgotten in our literary history, especially.
Thank you. And of course, some of you might know, of course, you actually might know Edwidge's writing because it's been hugely anthologized. And, I'm sure you may have read her without actually being aware that you've been reading her. And in London, Margaret, are you actually in London or are you in Ghana?
Who knows? I think I'm in London. I love it that nobody's where you think they are.
Well, it just shows you the Afro diaspora. I mean, it may be a temporary diaspora visit or whatever, but it's incredible. It's something to reckon with. I mean, that's a source of power. And of course, what you've done, Margaret, is that you've brought all of this together very powerfully in the New Daughters of Africa. For those of you who do not know Margaret Busby, OBE, Margaret is actually the grand dame of British publishing. She's the youngest female UK publisher and the first Black woman, as you heard in the film, and she founded with her partner, Clive Allison and Busby in the 1960s. It was pretty revolutionary. She's an extraordinary editor. I mean, almost every writer would say that, white and Black, that Margaret has been an instigator for them. She's been a fantastic role model. She's actually a change maker. She's shown that writing doesn't have borders. It doesn't live on continents. And interestingly, Margaret was named on the 2020 list of the 100 Great Black Britons, and that was voted on by the public with a scope of 400 years. So she's no ordinary mortal. If we could clap, you could hear us clapping, Margaret.
That's enough.
Anyway, Margaret, let's start with New Daughters of Africa. I mean, it's a formidable achievement. 25 years ago, the publishing world was not what it is now. And yes, the diaspora was there, but we didn't have the force we had now. A lot's happened. Was it hard to get the project off the ground all that time ago?
Well, I have to give you a bit of history because the project, actually, it was Daughters of Africa was published in 1992, but it was conceived a couple of years before that, at the end of the 80s, actually, when I met Candida Lacey, who was then an editor at a feminist publishing company called Pandora. And we met and we discussed, they just brought out an anthology of British women writers, with 2 editors dealing in English. And we decided that I'm going to take on the world, women of African descent in every language, every genre on my own. So Canada commissioned me to do this Daughters of Africa at Pandora. And then Pandora kind of moved, I think it was taken over, it became part of HarperCollins. So I followed Canada to HarperCollins. Then she moved to Jonathan Cape, so I followed to the Jonathan Cape. I was like her literary stalker. So the book actually was published by Jonathan Cape in 1992. And it was a wonderful feeling to have these women, more than 200 women of African descent in one volume. Because as I think it said in the film, which I found difficult to watch myself in, but at that point, you'd have thought there were just half a dozen women of African descent. And they were usually African American, you know, Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou and Alice Walker, and they were all great. And they're all in Daughters of Africa. But I wanted to say there are many more that people may not have heard of because they haven't been given the airtime, the literary space in literary magazines. And so when Daughters of Africa came out, it had a great impact, not only in terms of the people who bought the copies, but I think in terms of people who went on to become writers themselves. And I hope some of the panelists will tell how they came across it. So Canada left Cape and the book went out of print for whatever reason. And Canada and I kept in touch. And I always say she did me a favor. She gave me the best birthday present because she had a daughter on my birthday. And so roll on to the early 21st century, or no, I suppose we kept thinking, how can we bring Daughters of Africa back into print? And it was difficult because it would have had to pay a huge amount of money to all the people who'd already had the permissions fees. And we also wanted to have a sort of legacy to it. So Canada, as publisher of Myriad, commissioned me to do New Daughters of Africa, which was going to, again, feature women from around the world, through the generations, in every possible language. And we wanted to have some legacy. And the best thing I feel about New Daughters of Africa is all the wonderful contributors all waived their fees. So all of you wonderful people out there, Marina, Fanashe, Wanjiku, Edwige, Chimamanda, everybody waived their fees. And because of that, we have a scholarship which is called the Margaret Busby New Daughters of Africa Award, I think, which is a collaboration between Myriad Editions and the School of Oriental and African Studies at London University and the International Student House, which is a resident hall of residence, which means that a woman student from Africa can have a free course of study and accommodation at SOAS because of all the new daughters waiving their fees and all of us coming together to contribute to supporting a woman student who was already, the first student is already in place. She's from Kenya, she's called Idza, and we hope to be able to continue this scheme, which is all thanks to all the wonderful New Daughters of Africa to whom I have awarded something I call VOTAS, which stands for the Veritable Order of True African Sisterhood.
I like that. I think we should patent it.
Yeah, you can put it all after your name, Marina Slandy Brown VOTAS.
It rhymes with Bocas.
There you go.
But you know, Margaret, the thing about it really is that it sounds now like what you've done is you've actually compounded the impact, which is terrific, because I think this thing about legacy is so important. And you know, one of the things we talk about people in the diaspora is we're always reinventing the wheel, because we always think we're the first, and it's because we don't leave any legacy, no tangible legacy behind. And I think this is a really, really good way. But before we move on, one last question I want to ask you about that is, are you surprised that 25 years after you did, you know, 2019, after you did the first Daughters of Africa, that we actually needed a second one?
I'm not surprised, because there are just so many extraordinary writers who need to have a spotlight shone on them. And that's what I hope the book contributes towards happening. And I think what is also something that I find inspirational is that many of the writers in this volume and many of the current generation of writers have been inspired by Daughters of Africa. And I hope we'll hear from some of them how, whether it's that I think Candice Carty-Williams told me that she found a copy of Daughters of Africa on her godmother's bookshelf, and that inspired her. And I think Juanita Cox talked about she'd never seen any Black characters in the books she read at school, and Daughters of Africa inspired her from that perspective. And Edwige, well, you'll tell us your story, I'm sure, later, but it's that feeling that there's a chain, people are influencing each other, there's passing the baton. So there are people connected with the first volume and New Daughters in terms of relationship. For example, in the first volume, Alice Walker did feature. In the New Daughters of Africa, we have Rebecca Walker. In the first volume, there was Mabel Dove Dankwa from Ghana. In the second volume, Na Dove, her niece. So there are those connections, as well as the connections within the volume. For example, Zadie Smith's in New Daughters, and Zadie Smith's mother, Yvonne Bailey Smith, who has just begun her career as a novelist, is also in it. So there are so many connections. And the fact that people like Audre Lorde, who was in the first volume, has connected and inspired other writers is again a way of showing how those connections continue. And the fact that we keep saying, look at these wonderful writers, is a way to inspire writers for another volume, which I hope I'll do another day.
Well, Margaret, not even you could live forever. So another 25 years, it may be a little bit too gaga to do it, probably.
No, I'm not going to wait 25 years. Yeah, I could do one tomorrow.
Well, maybe somebody will just pick up the mantle and carry on.
I think I don't need to do it all alone on my own. I mean, there are lots of initiatives that have happened since. I mean, I can't talk about the other anthologies that this has inspired, or you know, I've given sort of endorsements to anthologies that have come out since this one. So I think that just to show people it can be done is partly what I'm glad to have been able to do.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Now let's hear some readings. Let's start with Edwige. Edwige, would you like to do, is your reading from New Daughters of Africa?
No, it isn't actually.
No, but let's hear your read.
Does it matter?
No, but let's hear you read, because you are writers. We want everybody who's taking part, listening in, to have a sample of how you read. And before she reads, I must say apologies on behalf of Chimamanda Adichie, who hoped to be here but had a family complication and couldn't make it to the last minute. So she sends her apologies to everyone. Edwige?
Yes, so this is actually an article I wrote maybe 3 or 4 years ago entitled Forgotten Trailblazers, the mayors, so the mayor meaning mothers, of the Negritude movement. And I am starting at the beginning, so I will just read. In May 1935, the word Negritude appeared for the first time in the only issue of the literary magazine L'Étudiant Noir, which Aimé Césaire set up with his friends Léopold Sédar Senghor and Léon Gontran Damas. Césaire, one of the Trois Pères, along with Senghor and Damas of the Black Francophone literary movement, defined it as the simple recognition of the fact that one is Black. However, before the Trois Pères, they were the mères, the mothers. To be called a nègre in the 1930s was to be a person of no value, a beast even. It was the racist term used by the French colonizers to refer to Africans in the colonies and in France. Therefore, the questions of who am I and who are we in this world of whites were ones that Black Francophones in France at that time were asking. The answers they were coming up with were that they were not what the colonizers wanted to portray them as. In 1924, the Caribbean writer Suzanne Lacascade elaborated on that answer in her only novel, Claire Solange, Âme Africaine. Claire Solange, the young mixed-race heroine of the novel, refuses to do what is expected of her in a racist society of Paris in 1914, which is to hide. Not only did Lacascade speak of the racism and the subjugation of the Black woman, she also went against the grain by writing the dialogues in Creole and depicting Caribbean society in minute detail. The other woman who not only wrote but also acted as an activist to answer that question of identity was Paulette Nadal, the first Black woman to enter the prestigious Sorbonne University. Nadal translated the writings of the poets of the Harlem Renaissance. With her sisters, Jane and André, she set up a literary salon, the Salon de Clamart, where she introduced young Africans and Caribbean students in Paris to the Harlem Renaissance writers. In 1935, when Césaire coined the word négritude, the precursory works of the Nadal sisters and Lacascade had already been muted. And by 1941, the movement was being identified solely with Césaire, Senghor, and Damas. And that's where it ends.
That's really interesting. Of course, the whole negritude movement is one of the defining movements in the African awakening, certainly for us in the Caribbean. It was a very, very important part. I mean, and it was interesting that at that time we were very integrated. So big ideas of that traveled. It was wonderful. I mean, in some ways, ideas don't travel so well. I mean, big ideas don't travel so well because there's so many things coming at you. But that was very interesting. Wanjiku, next.
Thank you. So I'm also going to read from this excerpt I'm going to read is from my forthcoming novel, Seasons in Hippoland, which primarily focuses on the power of storytelling. So in this excerpt, the narrator is a young woman. It's a coming of age novel, if you like. So this narrator is a young woman who's recalling her aunt Sarah's experiences. They're so vivid in her mind that they're almost magical, right? So the aunt was telling her about a particular time during colonial Kenya. So I'll just read. 7-year-old Sarah sits on a wooden bench watching her mother Rose, who stands in front of a table, looking down at the man in a green beret and a Luger pistol. I watch Sarah watching Rose, watching the green bereted man. I look around the room. I take 2 steps forward and stop. There is Sarah, knees shaking, arms on her laps, rubbing hands together. The room is cold. I myself feel the chill. I take turns staring at Aunt Sarah and then her mother. Rose remains calm, as if she knows their lives depend on her remaining calm and answering the most provocative questions. After the questioning, the green bereted man marches them through the back door to another place where more men in green are marching up and down the corridor, saluting the queen they'll never see. They stop when Rose is marched in front of them. Sarah is made to stand aside. I want to go stand by her, but we're separated by an invisible wall of time, so I watch helplessly. The green bereted men take turns. The green bereted men take turns pointing Luger pistols at Rose. She stands there, stoically facing several guns. Then the tall one comes to Sarah and hands her a pistol. It does not fit in Sarah's hand, but he shoves it in her hands anyway. Sarah told me that the gun felt cold in her hands. That's what she remembered mostly, and also that it was heavy. And now I can confirm it because there she stands, holding a pistol, being forced to point it at her mother, and the 7-year-old cannot do it or refuses to do it, but she ends up pointing the gun at her mother because somebody else forcefully helps hold the gun up. And Sarah does not want to look into her mother's face, and I don't want to look at both, so she and I look down the entire time. She hears them laugh, but still, she will not look at them or at her mother or at anything else. The man presses her index thumb on the trigger. She feels pain because he pushes her finger too hard, but still, she will not look up, even after the gun makes a click sound. She shuts her eyes so tight, they make a blanket of darkness, and her ears create a protective silence so profound it forces everything into slow motion. But her legs refuse her inner orders to flee, so she stands there, pistol in her hand, deaf to everything. Yeah, that's the end of that excerpt.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. Well, we await that novel eagerly. I mean, this whole idea of war is, talking about the things that hold us back. I hope we can cover some of that in, when we get on to talk about it. Let us now move on to our next reader, Hannah Shea. Please do us the honor. Are you reading from New Daughters of Africa?
Yes, I'm reading from New Daughters of Africa. I'm going to be reading from, it's an excerpt from These Bones Will Rise Again. And this is going to be page 767. The struggles over history are complex because the present continuously slips into the past, marking history as ambivalent, incomplete, a work in progress. History is like water. It lives between us and comes to us in waves. At times, it is still and unobtrusive. At others, it is turbulent and threatening. Even at its most innocuous, water poses hidden dangers, enclosing contested histories. And so we are always living in the tensions between tranquility and tumult. When we walk along the water's edge, it's easy to take for granted the complex process of how that water reached our feet, to overlook what is washed away, what alters and what holds in the sands of time. It is history as a series of waves, always in flux, a site of discovery in the past, present, and future, and not something stable, foreclosed, that is most troubling to nationalist agendas because it is too difficult to control. In the midst of these moving waves, far from the sturdiness of Sekuru Zumbira's granite boulders, the history I'm trying to craft begins with a moment etched on a surface that is man-made and more flimsy. Perhaps because of that fragility and more because of the dislocations and disjunctures across generations and space, this history begins with loss. The unsturdy surface is, or was, a studio photograph of Mbuya Lillian Chigumadzi as a young woman. I don't know whether it still exists. As a school child, this photograph was entrusted to my possession. I subsequently lost it, having, ironically, used it for a school project on family history. In it, she stands graceful, composed, sexy even. Her weight on her left leg and her right hip slightly tilted. A white cotton dress, stark against her dark skin, stretches a little over a rounded tummy and slim hips. A conical head wrap, the kind worn by Miriam Makeba, crowns her head. Lips part, revealing a cheeky gap to swallow the world. She doesn't smile. Eyes wide, she meets my gaze, demanding that I bear witness. Her statement, if I hear her correctly, unbought and unbasked. Just arrived in Umtali, with no young man preparing to persuade any uncles for cattle he's not yet worth to own. No white family with dirty kitchens, and children which need cleaning and who need raising. Alone, unburdened, unattached, only belonging to herself. Or so it is in my imagining. I look again. The photograph appeared to be taken in the 1960s. She would have been my age, her early 20s. A black and white photo with contrast softened by years of sun, sparks dulled by the weight of everyone else's future but her own. I bear witness to an epitaph that life has taught me. Sometimes dreams are colder than death. To my knowledge, this was the only individual portrait taken of my grandmother for decades. Perhaps this is what I loved most about that picture, that she was alone. She stood with no baby in her arms or on her back or husband by her side. I was struck by the way she didn't look like the grandmother I knew. And perhaps this is the point. She is not my grandmother in that picture. She is not Mbuya Chigumadzi, my Chigumadzi, Mrs. Kenneth Chigumadzi, my Rofina, Tete Lillian, Yaya Lillian. She just is. She belongs to no one but herself. She's Lillian. That is who I mourn, more than I mourn for my grandmother.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You hear the clapping, don't you? That's the thing about Zoom, but you can feel it. You can feel the clapping. Wonderful. That's just a sample, a very good sample of some of the wonderful things that appear in New Daughters of Africa. Margaret, are you going to read from New Daughters as well?
I think I will. I mean, I'm going to read from the paperback of the New Daughters of Africa, which actually is now dedicated to my sister Eileen, who did some of the French translation because she lived in Côte d'Ivoire in the 70s and 80s. But sadly, we lost her to cancer last year. And there are two other new daughters who, again, we lost in 2020. One was Andrea Levy, and the other one was Ghanaian writer Andai. So I'm going to read something which I will dedicate to all of you, all the daughters, my sister, the sisters we lost. But this is by Rachel Eliza Griffiths. It's a poem called Chosen Family. When you find your sisters, you'll still look over your shoulder sometimes to see if you're being followed. You're hoping one or two sisters you don't know will want to see where you're going. When you find your sisters, they won't ask you where you came from because they'll already know. And if they don't, they'll be busy putting good food on your plate and asking you if you're hungry or broke. When you find your sisters, your people, they'll tell you to use any bathroom you want, marry anybody you want, work side by side together for long hours in close quarters without any fear of being harmed. When you find your sisters, they'll throw the ball to you, offer you their love song and say you need to listen to this track and dance with us, whether or not you know all the steps. When you find your sisters, they'll say, "Do you remember?" And you'll say, "Yes," until you remember together the different ways the whole thing happened. When you find your sisters, they'll say, "Wear whatever you want. Wear the tightest dress, wear the pants, wear your birthday suit." They'll say, "We love your skin and drag and natural hair, and we love you naturally, so please just live and don't let anybody tell you, don't let anybody kill you or tell you they've killed you and you're just fine, the dead where you are." When you find your sisters, don't leave them and don't let them off the hook when they're in the wrong. When they're trying to take themselves out of the world, lay your hands on them and call them yours and yours and yours. When you find your sisters, be sure you've been preparing your heart the entire way by loving your difficult self and what you pretend you don't know, but you do know, so that when you see them smiling into your eyes, the soft or tough flags of their hands covering yours in a truth so light and fierce, you'll see you all have been midair for some time and could go higher and burn up some shit if you remembered what else is good everywhere and everywhere you look. That was by Rachel Eliza Griffith.
Thank you, Margaret. What all of those readings really tell us is that, you know, women are capable of doing things. I mean, we're capable of doing things together. We're capable of breaking the mold. We've got about 50 minutes or so, and I want to just go through some areas with you, which I outlined earlier. I mean, obviously, when you ask what is it about women that we know we're still 52% of the world's population, but you know we are a third poorer for the rest of our lives than men. We don't have all the top jobs. We can't get the same loans. We can't do this. We can't do that. Is it? People say, well, we just don't have good enough role models. We don't have women in leadership. I want to start there because would you all agree that I want to go around and I don't want to keep asking questions. So people do, writers, all of you do join in. I want to start this idea of leadership, women leadership. Is that the problem? Is that the key problem, that we don't have sufficient exemplar women? Would you say that was so? Margaret?
I think it's important for us to see each other, to see women in positions that we can aspire to be in as well. I certainly know that one of the women who inspired me to be involved in literature in Britain was somebody I saw on the cover of a literary magazine when I was still at school. She was a South African writer called Noni Jabavu. And I think she was the first African woman to have any sort of focus. She edited a British literary magazine. So she inspired me. And I was so thrilled late when I was a publisher to get a letter from her. But I think just being visible can be inspirational, just in the same way as the fact that Daughters of Africa exists inspired many writers. I hope that I keep referring to the fact that Edwige said something, I remember before we got to New Daughters, about how it inspired her to come across writers, women writers from every part of the world in Daughters of Africa. And I think it is that thing of thinking, well, these are roles we can all undertake, whether or not they're traditionally allocated to women or women are allowed in these positions. So I think it's important that we see ourselves as inspiring other women by example, as well as just by our presence.
Wanjiku, do you think it's important to have women in top jobs, not just being there as influencers, but being in top jobs and being able to make decisions? How, all of you, how important do you think that actually?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly important. And I do want to talk about a little bit about Daughters of Africa, because I remember the first edition many years ago, but I was working for a publishing company in Princeton. And that's when I saw this copy of Daughters of Africa. And you do think like these women, you know, are, like obviously I saw writers I'd already read, but then it was like, there were so many women writers, and that certainly had an impact on me. And so when I decided to write, it's Daughters of Africa that I remember. And so when I heard from Margaret about appearing in New Daughters of Africa, it was like an incredible feat, because I thought, well, I can be for somebody how the first edition was for me. But I do think that it's important for women to see other women in positions of power, other women writing. I remember seeing a poster of Sonia Sanchez when I was growing up, and it was just a poem on at home in my dad's library, and it was also a photo of, it was a drawing of Sonia Sanchez, and me thinking that is just incredible. And the words, I didn't even understand what the poem meant, but the words were certainly speaking to me. And so when I think about how did I get to be a writer, I certainly think about Sonia Sanchez, and I certainly think about Daughters of Africa, and also growing up watching Wangari Maathai. I think, you know, most obviously we all know who Wangari is, defying the government, you know, and making the inroads that she did, you know, as a young girl. That is definitely, and seeing her stand up to the government and seeing her stopping things that they were trying to do. Certainly, you know, I remember that moment. I remember the insults she got, but I remember her standing sort of stoically and, you know, taking on or taking on the government, as it were. And those images are very powerful for me. So I certainly, yeah, I think that we need to see more women in positions of power.
Paige, do you think that that women are not visible enough? Do you think that women should be actually in top jobs, with the president of the company, that, you know, the COO, the whatever it is? Do you think that that kind of role model is important in bringing about structural change?
You know, it isn't a case of being, you know, necessarily in a top job, because what do we call a top job? I think Margaret mentioned something earlier on by saying we just need to be there. You know, I set up, you know, this library in Abidjan. I am not in a top job, but I need to be there. I need to be there to shed light. By the way, Margaret, we do have your picture at the library, because for me it is important to show people that, you know, behind the writers we have the women who make the pot boil, the editors, the agents, the publishers. And going back to New Daughters of Africa, I mean, I would have written, I've always written. I think I put pen to paper the first time Daughters of Africa was being published in 1992. But I came across Daughters of Africa when I was living in England, when I was writing seriously. And and I am not ashamed to say this, because I think it is all very well having women in positions of power and having women at the top, but when we have women at the top and when we have women in positions of power, we must be honest about the struggle, about the path we took to be there. I know that I wrote like about 30,000 words of a novel that I was writing on, and the amount of research I did about Nigeria, and I had never been to Nigeria, because it was about representation. We were talking a lot about, African writers being on a scene, but it wasn't African writers being on a scene. It was Nigerian writers being on a scene. So I thought, if you need to be on a scene, you need to write, your story needs to be set in Nigeria. So you need to be talking about NEPA. Who the hell cares about Abidjan and whatever? So I read Daughters of Africa, and I saw these different, of course, Tajo was in there, but I saw these different women from different nationalities, from different countries being in there, from different languages being in there also. And I thought to myself, okay, I can stop with that research, because I didn't even know what Nigeria looked like. I didn't even know what kind of English they spoke there. So, I had the courage to, to step into my power and to write, and set my stories in Cote d'Ivoire with the language that I knew, with, the ideas that I knew. So it is okay having women in positions of power, women being in top job, but we mustn't think that top job is being a president of a corporation. Even for me, even the cleaner who is in that company, she is an inspiration to somebody who is perhaps saying, oh, I can't work because da da da. So she's an inspiration to somebody. And, we must be honest with our stories, with our path. It isn't easy being a woman, in positions of power, whatever that power may look like or be.
Yes. The thing about it is that a lot of people don't actually understand how power works or where power is. So, for example, you might see a writer's work, have a lot of become very trenchant, but they have the power to influence a lot of people's ideas, etc. But do they have the power to get other people published? I mean, Margaret talks quite elegantly about the fact that, she asks a lot of people, everybody in this room, put up your hand if you want to be a writer. And everybody's hand goes up, and just, who wants to be an editor? Nobody. Do you want to be a publisher? Nobody wants to be. And this is about how you, in the end, change things. Does that resonate with you at all, Panache?
If you don't mind, Marina, I'm going to go back to the question about women and representation and power. In the first place, because I'm going to be a bit sort of throw the pigeon into the cats a little bit with this one. And of course, I grew up in South Africa, and the people that I think about when I think about women, in South Africa, Women's Month is in August, and that's for the famous 1956 Women's March to Parliament. And that's where we hear things like Watintum Faz, Watintum Bogoja, right? So if you strike a rock, you strike a woman, or you strike a woman, you strike a rock. But I would like to complicate this a little bit, because I think sometimes the trouble with representation politics is that we also kind of get into sort of lean-in politics, that it all becomes sort of about women who must break the glass barrier, the glass ceiling, and that kind of thing. And who's left to be cleaning, as Edwidge was talking about? What about the woman who has to clean that glass ceiling? Who has to look after those women's children, for example? And I don't think, for example, someone like me, is not progressive to see someone as the vice president of an empire like the United States. What do we mean by positions of power if we're not fundamentally transforming what we mean by power, if we're not fundamentally transforming the entire basis of society? So this is whether it's Black people, whether it's queer people, all kinds of so-called underrepresented peoples. If we're not talking about what does this power mean in the very first place, we're going to have woman face, we're going to have Black woman face, all those kinds of things. So you're having Black women to sort of rubber stamp the evils of empire. And I grew up in South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, and you see many of these kinds of things where the basis of the economy has not changed. The power still remains in white hands, but you have a few Black faces. You can have a Black government, but still have an anti-Black country. So just like in America, for example, where I am, having someone like Kamala Harris as the vice president, that to me, that's not necessarily progress for Black women. What does it mean for Black women across the world? What does it mean for people of African descent across the world? Is it progressive to have a first Black princess? Because I think we begin to sort of applaud anything and everything because we're just happy to see Black people represented. But we have to ask, what exactly are we being represented in? I want nothing to do with the royal monarchy. I would want us to wash our hands clean of that. We don't want to. So the trouble with sort of always sort of wanting a seat at the table, perhaps we don't want that table. We want our own completely. So I think we need to maybe be a little bit more critical. When we, often people think, talk about, oh, Africa has no leaders. Africa's problem is because we don't have leadership. Well, what about the murder of Lumumba? What about the assassination of Lumumba? What about the assassination of Sankara? What happens when we do have examples of people-focused revolutionary leadership that's there, but immediately is undermined? We're Haiti right now. We can see what's happening with the United States. If right now, it is undermining a people's revolution. So if we then, and of course, they've had a woman president, a US-backed woman president. So I think it's important for us to be critical of what we mean by representation. I just would like to also speak about the example of women in parliament. In South Africa, we have over, let's say, 50% of women who are in parliament. You also get things like that in places with post-conflict societies like Rwanda. But South Africa is one of the societies with one of the highest rates of femicide. We have one of the highest rates of rape outside of a conflict zone. What does that representation actually mean for women on the ground? Many of the people who are defending the president with his rape case were women of the ANC Women's League. Very often the people who are charged with representing us in South Africa are the ones who end up defending the patriarchs and become victors of patriarchy. So for me, I no longer see it as necessarily progressive to have a woman leader because we have not spoken about what is the basis of power, what exactly are we stepping into? And I think that's a really important part of how we need to talk about the issues of so-called representation. I'm not interested in lean-in feminism or having, girl bosses who are going to simply perpetuate, patriarchy, but in pink.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. And that's why I want to move on to what actually underpins these things, because I actually do believe you need structural changes. So, and a lot of people don't understand that. They actually think that the thing they see is the power. It isn't. There are all these people behind pulling the levers. So let us talk about that. Let us talk about what I think. Maybe you may not agree with me, but I think that economics is what underpins everything. Economics underpins politics, it underpins everything. Money, who's got the power? I think money is power, really, and the economic structure is what is really important. So let us talk a little bit about that. How do you think then that we can change those things that underpin it? Like, how can we organize ourselves to do all of the things that you just said, Panache, that are absolutely correct? When you've got religious beliefs, you've got women. Actually, one of the comments we've got here is that women are their own worst enemies. Often women are the reasons for their own paralysis and their powerlessness because they actually don't probably recognize this. What about education? What about religious, you talked about the patriarchy. How can we, I'd like us to move on and talk a little bit about that. I mean, who would like to start? Edwidge. Because Cote d'Ivoire is one of those countries which held so much promise, and then everything unraveled. And I have no idea what's happening there now, but I mean, it's been, like so many countries in Africa, things, well, everywhere really, not just Africa, when you think things are just breaking through and then they just pulled back because essentially we haven't got rid of things that actually underpin, the status quo in the first place.
I actually don't know who said that Cote d'Ivoire had so much promise. I never saw it as a promising country. I mean, we had the Ivorian miracle in, the 70s and the 80s, and Singapore Prime Minister came on a visit in the early 80s, and he said, this was the ambition of Singapore to be like Cote d'Ivoire, but we were just, living on debt. If I go and I take a lot of debts and I live in a big duplex and I'm driving a Range Rover, that doesn't mean, this is my favorite car, by the way, that doesn't mean that, I am living well. I'm just living on credit. So that's what Cote d'Ivoire was doing. But you're right in saying, the thing, so some of the things that underpin that, that supposed, Ivorian miracle I do not know. It is true that money is power. I do agree that money is power, but to make money at the moment, again, what are the things that we need to change? And when you speak of Cote d'Ivoire, and we speak of the patriarchy, and we speak of misogynistic behavior, and we speak of sexism, I think it is about, we were talking about women in power earlier on, and I think it is about showing different all women. So it isn't, I really hate the fact that some women need to be role model because of, what they have achieved. So like, let's say Ngozi Iweala can be a role model because she's at the head of the, I don't know how you say it in English, OMC, and Stephanie Sinclair, who was a gangster head in the 1920s in New York, cannot be. And I think it is about knowing the stories of, I go back to stories again. It's about knowing the stories of, of women. But I do not know like how, we can change things. I do not know. All I know and all I'm trying to change here in my country, in Cote d'Ivoire, is having portrayals of different women who look like us, women who are Black, women who are African, women who are poor, rich, middle class, rural women, urban women, showing these different examples so that people can identify with this and that woman and say, oh, so I don't need to have been to school to do this. Look at the Nana Benz, look at Margaret Busby, so maybe I can be like a publisher. Look at Naomi Campbell, I can be a model. It is completely okay. So it is about showing these different examples. Voila.
Wanjiku, would you say that women, picking up on Panash's point, that women need to reclaim, part of everything that has actually excluded them? I mean, I happen to think that the whole question of power is, as you know, about economics, is actually a feminist issue, but we don't seem to treat it like that. We don't actually, if we're talking about true gender equality, we don't, the talk about money or finance and restructuring that doesn't actually come into it very much.
Yeah, and well, going back to Panash's point, I do think that we do need to also define, like Panasha was saying, kind of like, what do we mean by power, and so obviously a woman doing, head of something can inspire an individual woman somewhere. But I also want to get back to the point where, I also do want to point out that, seeing someone do something, someone who has been, who's sort of been through the experiences that you think you've been through, will certainly help you carve a path for yourself. So for instance, when we're talking about women change makers in society, I don't think we're always necessarily talking about, presidents or Wangari Maathai. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. For us women, we actually don't need to go too far to find the women who've influenced us most. If I look at my grandmother, I come from a family of writers, but it's always the case that people think that, I obviously taking after my dad, or that he was an influence, and he certainly was. But I think it's his sister, for instance, who made me a writer, so to speak, and it's interesting because she was really good in school. She was brilliant, in the early 40s and all that. But when it came down to who would go to school, because they didn't have enough money in the family, they chose, my dad as opposed to my aunt. But she was just a brilliant storyteller. And so when I think about stories, as she's also the woman, in fact, my current novel is dedicated to her. It's completely influenced by her voice and the way she told stories. But that can be a powerful role model. It doesn't necessarily have to be, or we don't have to think about role models in that way. Role models is a woman who's doing things, who's pushing boundaries right where you are, So I do.
How do we harness that power? Because what men are very good at is You know, I mean, Panache maybe, and Margaret, you've worked in Margaret, I know, has worked in a rarefied man's world. We've got power, but how do we harness that power to change the things that actually hold us down? Panache, what would you say?
I would defer to Margaret first. Like, how do we actually change that, and how I come?
Well, if I knew the answer, it'd be. I mean, I think we have to do a lot of things, and Panache made a lot of very good points. Now, it's not only the women who are visibly seen as leaders who have the power. I mean, there's power in the whole wages for housework movement shows you that. The fact that somebody like Kwame Nkrumah had such support from the market women. It's not only the named women who have the power or who should be given credit for change in society. Just in the same, there are certain jobs. I always talk, for example, about the job of being an editor, which can be totally invisible. You do it well, nobody knows you exist. They'll say, what a great book, what a wonderful writer. So it's not that one always has to be powerful and be seen to be powerful, but you can be powerful in terms of what you do, what you deliver. Toni Morrison, getting back to writing, to literature, Toni Morrison is renowned as a wonderful writer and full of wisdom, and I'm always looking to not only her fiction, but her non-fiction. Her essays are remarkable. But she also enabled a lot of people to become writers, to have their writing showcased, because she was also an editor. So I think there are different ways in which you can be powerful, in which you can influence others, and you may not be given the credit for it, but that doesn't mean to say you have to give up those positions of power that are unnamed. And I think one doesn't have to perpetuate things like acquiescing to patriarchy. And it's not always the case that that happens, but somehow we have to disrupt the narrative that women are only powerful when they're seen to be in titles of power.
Yeah.
But I can't say that I have the answers to how to solve the situation. And maybe other people on this panel do, but I mean, I certainly know that we just have to keep on the struggle, keep fighting, not actually giving up, saying, well, it's too hard, because it's never going to be easy.
But Margaret, you talk a lot about the fact that what we should do is act together. We derive a lot of power by acting together. And the New Daughters of Africa shows that. I mean, so many writers would not have been writers without that. But what you did, you brought it all together. Actually, everybody sitting on this panel has actually done something, have exercised that kind of structural, something to do with changing structural power. I read something really interesting, that in the United Kingdom, for example, female entrepreneurs receive only 1 pence for every £1 of funding given to startup businesses. Now, we know that the pandemic, for example, has set a lot of women back, but it's actually created a lot of opportunities. Women are extremely entrepreneurial. Without women everywhere in the world, Africa, India, working and doing all sorts of creative, innovative things to survive, a lot of society wouldn't function. A lot of people in civil society are women. So how is it that we are so entrepreneurial, we're so innovative, we're the one coming up with the ideas, and why don't we get the funding? Who are the people giving out the funding? They're a bunch of men. So how do we, what do we do about that? I think there's certain things like education. Let's talk about education. How does education work? I mean, at the moment, the figures are astonishing. I mean, the numbers of young people, I must try and find it for you. The number of people, of women in Africa who are not going to school. Well, I see it here in the Caribbean, and it must be the same in India, we know. Women are kept out of the educational system. Now that directly impacts how you could, if you can, you know, do your PhD, whether you can get a job, you know, what you can do. So Let's talk about that. 49 million girls out of primary and secondary school in sub-Saharan Africa, and 31 million of them out of secondary education. Now, what's the impact of that? And what's causing it? Is it a patriarchal society? How can we, what are we going to do about this? How can we use what we do? How do we change that dynamic?
Marina, I don't know if you mind, but I just sort of want to also just come back a little bit to what Margaret's saying and speak to what you're saying right now. Just maybe something about perhaps thinking about educating ourselves and thinking about understanding the predicament that we're in, and maybe being specific about the problem facing daughters of Africa, not just women in general, but specifically us as daughters of Africa, the people who were created in the wake of transatlantic slavery. Because very often, I think it was interesting that Chibundu made the point in the video, say when you speak about Pan-Africanism, people now, particularly in the post-World War phase, tend to think of Pan-Africanism as something that's very much continental Africa. Sort of forget about many of the early progenitors of Pan-Africanism, at least as we know it, who were in the historic diaspora. And one of the people who I always think is fantastic, I'm always quoting him in some of the work that I do, is, for example, Margaret's great-grandfather, George James Christian, and just sort of the work that he did at the first Pan-African conference in 1900, and the kind of work that they were doing in sort of the way in which, and if you think about education at that time, the way in which solidarity networks worked at that time, knowing sort of, for example, in South Africa, the first Black woman to get a university degree was Charlotte Maxeke, who was the first Black woman or first woman to be the head of the ANC Women's League in South Africa. And she had gone to the AME Church's Wilberforce University in America. And there were all these different transatlantic networks. And she had gone there because of the fact that in Southern Africa, you could not get a tertiary education as a Black person at the time. But what enabled her to get that education was the historically Black institutions that were here. And that's how she moved then through the historic African choir and that sort of thing. What I just wanted to highlight there a little bit is maybe thinking about, at a more broad level as well, is the fact that perhaps we are not understanding the problem facing us, particularly as people of African descent, as a world that was created in the wake of transatlantic slavery. So that when we think about monies, we think about capitalism, and particularly the term racial capitalism, it was built on our backs. Mm-hmm. So at whatever point we are working towards, we have to understand that we are the basis of the economy. If a man makes $1, and let's be specific, a white man makes $1, a Black man probably makes, let's say, well, it will be a white woman, then it will be a Black woman, a Black man, and then it will be the Black woman right at the very bottom. We are the basis of the world's economy, and thinking about enslaved women as the labor that has created the world. And I think it's quite important, because sometimes I wonder about sort of the limits of education as a transformative vehicle, because, for example, in America, we find that the most educated groups of people in America are Black women. They're the most qualified, and yet they're the least paid. In South Africa, what you find in the universities is that what we had is that historically you could teach with a master's degree, but as soon as Black people started speaking about social transformation and decolonization, you need a PhD. So there's a way in which credentializing was a way of taking us out, and sort of then saying that the kinds of education that we have, or the kinds of qualifications you have, are not fit for purpose. Of course, it's a very different matter to sort of primary school education and that kind of thing. But what I'm trying to point to is perhaps the problem is a lot bigger than we're thinking of, that the world is built on Black dispossession. The dispossession that starts in transatlantic slavery and then is reinscribed with colonialism and neocolonialism and apartheid and that kind of thing. So if we use someone like Amos Aze's words, we need to end the world because it is built on our dispossession. Because I'm not sure that some of maybe the common sense policy decisions, I think of course it's important for the mitigation. Of course, I'm going to always be for the education of women and that kind of thing. My own grandmothers didn't go to school, as the kind of story that Wanjiku is speaking about. They were very intelligent people, but did not have the kind of opportunities. But the point being that I'm not sure that even with some of the education, they would have necessarily gotten some of the opportunities, because of the fact that the world and many of the countries that we're in specifically is built on Black labor and particularly Black women's uncompensated labor. And I don't know if that's something that we're going to fix just through education, for example. I think we'd have to fundamentally change the basis of society, and that calls for a revolution. And I think that's really that subtle undertone of what I'm saying, and ending the world there. But I think some of those things, if we maybe perhaps in the education that we are giving, is to also think about the fact that this has to be within the long durée of what has happened and what brought us to this point, specifically as daughters of Africa and not just women in general.
And sorry,
I wanted to jump in, Marina. You mentioned about girls not going to school in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think we also need to define what do we mean when we say education, because even the people, I mean, I'm talking about the case of Cote d'Ivoire, even the people who go to school here, you have people who have done 2-3 years of university, but they cannot, they cannot use a computer, to be very basic. It is about the quality of the education we are giving here. Is it an education that is adapted to our realities? Is it an education? Because you have a lot of people who say, I have a master's, I have a BA degree, I have an HND, but it means nothing. It means nothing if you cannot use that, if you cannot apply critical thinking to that education, that you've had. And of course, we also have, societal issues whereby we say, oh no, we are not going to, in the case of, some women, we're not going to go too far because then we may not, the guy will be scared or, but really we need to define what we understand by education. I know that, in my case, when my daughter was in age of going to school, I put her in an Ivorian private school. But in the end, I had to remove her from there because the classroom sizes were too big, because there was, it was, rote repetition. And I put her into a French private school. Now, it was in that French private school that she learned our national anthem, the national anthem of my country, Cote d'Ivoire. Why are we not learning that in our, in our national, if in our national schools, we are still learning about, the superficial area of France? Who cares for the superficial area of France? What Ivorian person cares for the superficial area of France? Why are we not even learning our national anthems in our own schools? So we need to be also, looking at all these issues. What do we mean when we say education? And in terms of working together, I think, like Panache said, and like Margaret says, yeah, we need to work together as those women who understand some of these issues. Then how can we work together so that we are actually giving an education, not just an instruction?
Yeah, and I just do want to add on to that, because I think that that it's important to also note that women have also been at the forefront of so many things and so many struggles. And sometimes we just don't know who they are. Women were, for instance, in Kenya, women were part of the Mau Mau arms resistance against the British. My grandmother was, women's role in like the Algerian Revolution, or in recent years, women at the forefront in the Egyptian uprising and other pro-democracy movements that we know of. So I think even incorporating, having these kind of discussions, but also incorporating that in education, for instance, so that we can see how we women have also played a role in changing society. It might not look like we've done a lot, but we've certainly, or women have certainly done a lot in terms of changing, of moving the sort of discussion forward, and also changing the power dynamics and all that. But I think it's always important to remember that, so that we don't, yeah.
There's a comment here from Charu Tukral in India. Well, I imagine it's India. Yes, in India. And she says, they did some research in the agri space and found that many ag tech enterprises were not able, women, to take their solutions. They couldn't take their solutions to women farmers because the women are not literate enough and could not use the solutions. But the solutions but the solution does not necessarily need to be fixed by improving the education numbers? Well, the solution is actually that you need to educate more women so that they can actually take advantage of innovations and innovative solutions. You know, it's interesting this, but even sometimes the way in which things are expressed do not help people. So for example, blind people, if you go into a lift, you know, the numbers 1, 2, 3 should be written in Braille so that you can actually enable them to use the lift without aid. So that sometimes the solutions themselves are not helpful in people being able to bring about the change. So I remember that in, for example, in Britain, they were saying, well, why aren't more women becoming fire officers? And then they discovered that the criteria for becoming fire officers meant that you had to be over 5'7" and you had a chest size this big or feet that big. And of course, no women, they said, oh, we don't exclude women, but in fact they did, without actually thinking, actually realizing that the structures in place actually meant that certain people were excluded. There's some other comments here about disrupting the narrative. Do we need mentorship? I mean, mentorship is a very powerful tool that has been used, you know, officially. Is it something that Margaret, that you've been involved in active membership of mentorship of women?
Oh, certainly I have, and it is important. First of all, I'd like to thank Panache for mentioning my grandfather, George James Christian, who actually was from Dominica, but he was a delegate at the first Pan-African Conference, and he went to Ghana in 1902, or the Gold Coast as it was then. But another point, I wish I could just listen rather than talking myself, because there's so many things that resonate with me. But my grandmother, who was my grandfather, George James Christian's first African wife, actually, she was a powerful woman. She was a stalwart in the family, but she didn't have formal education in terms of being able to read or write. That didn't mean she wasn't educated as such. And I always remember the fact that my mother talked about, she was actually a midwife, but she told me that as my siblings and I were being put through school, my father, who was a doctor, who again come from the Caribbean to the Gold Coast, my mother had to save money. She had one dress which she'd wear in the day, wash at night, and wear the next day. So there were all these sacrifices that were being made by women who were in the background to enable the next generation to continue. So I think there are many, many issues, and even in terms of the wider picture. So it's not simply that we focus on the problems that women have, but the problems that relate to the transatlantic slave trade, as was mentioned before. What about reparations? How do we get beyond those wider issues that affected us and still continue to affect us, even more so as being women of African descent, or women in general, or of African descent in the Western world? So there are too many issues for me to try and address them all. I wish I could just listen to you all without having to talk myself, because it's just so perceptive what Wanjiku has said, what each of you has said is just so relevant.
Mm-hmm. But you see, Panache's point is absolutely, she hits the nail right on the head. The thing is, these are huge issues. These are, you know, we can't out ourselves, like Emmy Cesar said, you know, we can't all, so it's a question of, I actually think that we can all make a big change in our little areas. The question is, how do we then join up the dots? How do we turn these single acts into big acts that actually are shifting? And I must say this, I must put my hand up and say, you know, I worked in a large corporation, and the worst people there were women. The women bosses were the worst. They're the ones who chopped you off at the knees. They were the ones who held you down. It's not nice to say that, but it's true, because, you know, it's women just fighting for the crumbs, and they would kill people, you know, to get that bit of crumb. And we have to stop that, because we can be our own worst enemies. I think that what do you say about how do we educate women? And okay, we talk about women, and I take totally the point about the remnants of, you know, of the slave economy, the world slave economy. But how do we teach women to recognize their power, and to make it matter? How do you, if we agree what the problems are, which we do, we've identified some of them, how do we then empower women to start making a difference, Banashe?
You know, in South Africa, we have a huge discourse. And again, South Africa is a great example because we talk all the right talk, supposedly. We have Women's Day, we have all these wonderful things. And we've grown up with the discourse of women's empowerment. And again, we're in a society where it's the highest rates of femicide. You're more likely to be killed by your partner, your intimate partner. You have some of the highest rates of sort of what we call so-called corrective rape. So sort of the murder, the intentional murder of lesbians in townships or Black lesbians specifically, all of those kinds of things. So to say that we have all these sort of de jure kind of ways in which we can speak to empowerment. But I think part of what I found over the years is that it's not so much a question of empowering women, because that then sort of externalizes the problem onto those who have been, externalizes the problem onto the victims, right? So i.e. we're in specifically an anti-Black society, a so-called post-apartheid society that was built on the backs of Black women, historically Black people in general, but Black women in particular. So when the discourse of empowerment is to say, now, how does the woman look at herself differently? But we're not talking about what are the structures daily that even if I do look at myself differently, what is going to push me back down, right? Because we know that we are punished, maybe at a very familiar level. So we can talk about the interpersonal level. I'll have one of my uncles who say to me, oh, it's so fantastic that you're doing your PhD. It's really, really great or whatever, but don't overdo it, you know, because you need to come back and you need to find a man who will, you know, so there's that. I've always been told I'm too much, to this, to that. Things that I know that had it been a male would have been a very different response. Someone like Winnie Mandela, we don't even have to look far. Winnie Mandela, the consequences for being the kind of leader that she was a people's leader, being the conscience of the nation. There were huge consequences for that. She didn't become the Mandela of the world. Right, and it took Black women, in particular young Black women, saying hands off Winnie Mandela to sort of reclaim that legacy. But the point being that it's not so much, I think, a question of empowering women. It's a question of dismantling, and rather not, and I want to say specifically, it's not just a question of empowering Black women. It's a question of dismantling historic anti-Blackness and historic anti-Black womanness, because the problem is not us. It's the way in which the world is structured, and we need to dismantle those systems, because what you're going to find is that it's going to be the woman who pops her head up, and continuously we're going to be punished for that. And we see that all the time. Women at all kinds of levels are always being punished. We can see it in our families, whether so-and-so, she talks too much, she thinks she's so in this, she thinks XYZ, or the person doesn't get the promotion because they're too much, they're too that. And it's then not surprising that when we do find women in positions of power, whether it's even in the family or whether it's in corporations or in government, the basis of your incorporation or the basis of your seat at the table is that you're going to maintain the status quo. It's not on the basis that you're going to disrupt this place. So again, then it's a question of how do we dismantle the power structure? Otherwise, we'll continuously see ourselves having to then fold ourselves or assimilate into the basis of power. And very often across the world, I'd be hard pressed anywhere in the world where you tell me that the power structure is not fundamentally anti-Black and fundamentally anti-Black women.
Yeah, well said, Banashe. In fact, I'll have to connect you with my partner, Luke Daniels, who's writing something about gender-based violence in Africa. So I'm sure there'd be a lot of things that you could talk with him about.
So can I just add as well, one of the things, for example, when we talk about things like microfinance, part of the problem, again, with things like that, was that women would get, you know, particular kinds of opportunities. Women would be given resources and that kind of thing, but they still had to go back home to their husbands. And many of them face gender-based violence. We know that these cases in many places, I know people in my own family who've done very well. But again, because of the historic undermining of Black families, historic undermining of Black men, all kinds of things, you come back home and your husband is not happy that you're doing XYZ. So now you have to face gender-based violence. So it's just to say that even when women are so-called empowered, there are always going to be consequences so long as the society is based on our disposition.
I totally agree with that. And we've got 2 minutes left only. I don't know, the time just disappeared. We've just got 2 minutes left, but you know, it brings me back, your point is absolutely correct, that we can't do it on our own. We're just part of the thing. I mean, 50% or 48% of the world are men. Now, how do we get men to change? Because it's not our problem. It's about being Black is not my problem, it's your problem out there. So how do we change that? I mean, you know, I brought about education, I talk about finance, all these things. But in the end, we've got to change somebody's mind. Many of us are mothers, not all of us, but the people who do this to us are the systems that men uphold. How do we change men? Let's just end on that note. We've got 2 minutes left. Let's start with you, Panache. Maybe you don't agree with me, but what do you think?
It's a big question. How do we change men?
You've got 10. Well, you're mothers. We are mothers. Think about it. And we're grandmothers, aunts, and uncles. Think about it.
Is that we don't need any solitary, I'm going to paraphrase Toni Morrison, we don't any more heroic women as solitary heroes. We need a heroic women's movement that's militant, assertive. That's what we need. We don't need individual women anymore. That's what I would say.
Yeah. It's a system and men uphold it. How do we, what do you say to that, Rojiki?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I also feel like that I can't, like, I do want to point out the role of government, for instance, in Kenya, this neo-colonial governments, because I think there's also a way that, I do think that men and women have also fought or have been fighting or involved in movements to sort of bring about change. And I do want to point that out because it can get also very tricky sometimes when we kind of sort of put forth the idea that women are necessarily fighting men when men and women are going through the same systems of oppression by, say, the Kenyan government. But I think that's important to note or to point out that, yeah, there are many movements in Kenya, for instance. There are people doing a lot of work, and it's both men and women, even as, of course, women have also their particular way that they're, you know, double oppressed, if you like that. But I think it's important to note that.
Okay, we got 30 seconds left, Edwige, and then Margaret.
We cannot, you know, we cannot change men. Let's leave men out of this thing. Let's completely leave them out. Let's just, let's just step into our own powers. So, like here, for instance, on the issues of, men, they will have a child with somebody and then they'll say, oh, no, I don't have the means to look after that child. We need to be sufficiently educated that we take that man's ass to the court and say, you will pay this amount of money. No question of saying, this is what I have. If this is what you have, you cannot be part of my child's education, step out. But to be able to say that you need to have the means to educate that child of your own self. So it's about, solidarity, getting together, telling, another sister, this is the steps of stepping into your own power. Let's leave the men out. When we are strongly powerful, they will come.
Margaret, last word to you.
Well, I think that word solidarity is great. We need to solidarity. We need to, each one teach one is a good motto. I mean, I would not know Panache but for Ella Rakatama. We have to realize that we can actually each influence each other. And one of the new daughters is a woman called Verna Wilkins, who's done a lot of work with young children, written books for children. And she says that you have to start by teaching the children that they too can be writers, editors, publishers. So if you start with that first generation, maybe by the time they grow up, male or female, they will not just accept the patriarchal system, and there'll be no need for us to be saying, how do we change them?
Okay, thank you so much, Edwige, Ranjiku, Panache, Margaret Busby, and huge thanks to Ariel Molino and Nicola Cross for the film, and huge thanks to Sankalp and for inviting us all to take part. Everybody enjoy the rest of the Africa Summit, and lovely to meet all you fantastic women. Like everybody else on the chat, I feel totally inspired by you.
Thanks, Marina.
Thank you so much, Marina.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Margaret.
All you vote us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you all soon somehow, I hope.
Day.
Bye.
Bye. That was nice. No. Hi, that was so lovely. We
I still want to go.
Natasha
We have
made
to go.
wonderful points, but we just couldn't drill down.
Take care, everybody.
All right, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Lovely. Continued
Take
success.
care.
And all of you with your writing.
And love to your mum, Marina. Love to your mum, Nicola. Love to your dad,
That
Wendy.
was fantastic. Thank you all very, very much. Yeah.
Bye.
All right, bye. See you.
Bye. Bye.